Hey everyone, it's Chris. We are jumping into the parable of the sower. It's actually going to take us 4 different devotionals to cover this thing in a way that doesn't give us a 25-minute devotional, okay? So we're going to jump into Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 3. Jesus says, "Listen. A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered away because they had no root." Verse 7, "Other seed fell among thorns which grew up and choked the plants so they did not bear grain." Verse 8, "Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, 60, or 100 times what was sown." Then Jesus said, "Whoever has an ear to hear, let him hear." So here's an interesting thing is that this parable is found both in Mark chapter 4 and Matthew chapter 13. We're going to go back and forth between the two because they each have subtle nuances. Secondly, this is really the only one that Jesus explains to his disciples what it means. So in verse 14 of Mark 4, Jesus says, "The farmer sows the word. Some people are like seed along the path where the word is sown. As soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown to them." Now, Matthew chapter 13, verse 18 says the same thing, has a little different nuance though. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom, so Mark said, the sower sows the word, and then Matthew defines it. The word is the message about the kingdom. And then Matthew adds this, "and does not understand it." So it's not necessarily that your heart is just hard and you reject it. Now that could be the case. You could just be rejecting God's word, or somebody could just be rejecting God's word. It can also be that somebody's hearing God's word and they're not processing it. They're not understanding it. In both cases, Satan, the enemy, the evil one, comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. So remember, we said that parables have a heavenly principle and an earthly principle, and they mirror one another. What is the heavenly principle? I believe the heavenly principle is simple. Check your heart at the door. Is your heart ready to receive the truth of God's word? Sometimes the truths are hard. Sometimes the truths have made me really have to look deep inside because I wanted God's word to say something that it didn't really say. One of the things I talked about Sunday is this is one of the reasons I dig so hard when I'm ministering God's word, because I don't want to stand before God one day and hear that from God's mouth that I manipulated his word for my own personal agenda. So that's the heavenly principle. Is my heart right to receive God's word? Now, what's the earthly principle? You and I are meant to sow God's word to everyone. We are meant to spread the kingdom of heaven to everyone. Jesus said, "Go preach the gospel and make disciples." And if we keep running into hard hearts, then you know what our response is? Keep sowing God's word. Because sometimes it's absolute rejection, but sometimes it's misunderstanding. And our responsibility is to pray for those hearts to be softened so that when we minister God's love and God's word, hearts are receptive. So let us continue to sow God's word, sow his message to everyone. Let me say it again. Let's continue to sow the message of God's word, of his love, of his redemption, of his restoration, of his reconciliation, of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ to everyone, so that hearts would be changed for God's glory and souls would be won into God's kingdom. God bless you. Have a great week. I can't wait to see you Friday as we unpack another portion of the parable of the sower.